Hi, folks, and welcome back to part two of the Dogma of Molecular Biology. In part one, I explained that it's not scientifically possible for the system of molecular biology to come into existence via evolution, and therefore it's a death sentence for evolution. But there are more reasons for this that I haven't explained yet, which is what I want to do in this video. I ended last time saying I wanted to tell you about how the evolutionists thought they had something to say about the origin of life. You see, it's not just the dogma of molecular biology that it's a closed system, so you need all the parts to appear simultaneously. Even if you put this aside and overlook it, how each part originated, the DNA, the RNA, and the proteins, it's still a huge problem for evolution. So let's set that aside for a moment, just for the sake of argument. But remember, as I already explained, you can't actually do that. But anyway, let's try and see what happens. According to evolution, all these parts, the DNA, the RNA, and the proteins, had to have been able to arise on their own with no help from any other parts, because none of the other parts would have been there yet. And all these molecules are made up of individual building blocks. The DNA and the RNA are made up of building blocks called nucleotides, while proteins are made up of building blocks called amino acids. And by the way, do you know what you call an acid with an attitude? Amino acid. I am the funniest guy I know. Just ask me, I'll tell you all about it. So anyway, you can view these building blocks as individual Lego pieces. And I happen to have some of those here, okay? Legos are just awesome, I think. Anyway, where was I? The building blocks of these molecules must be brought together. Now I'm distracted because I'm playing with the Legos. Anyway, we'll get back to that. The building blocks of these molecules, the DNA, the RNA, and the proteins, they must be brought together and assembled by the proteins whose job it is to do so. This would be some of the 100 or so protein molecules I told you about in the last video. And as I said in the other video, there's a mountain of data that shows this. It's not even debatable. It's the only thing that's ever been observed in regard to how these molecules are created. They must be assembled. And now, I'll play with these Legos some more. We'll illustrate this with the Legos. Once again, like I said, these things are awesome. They're so clever. The idea is clever. The design is clever. In fact, I wish I would have invented them, right? Just like the pieces of Lego. You take a couple of them, right? They must be put together by an outside force. Your hands doing so, right? The building blocks of DNA, the RNA and the proteins, must also be assembled by something else, the proteins whose job it is to do so. So this is another critical piece to understand. The building blocks of DNA, RNA, and proteins, just like these Legos, they will not self-assemble. They do not self-assemble because they do not have an affinity for one another. There's no naturally occurring forces of attraction between the subunits. It does not happen on its own. Folks, these are the data. And so I take these Legos back apart, right? I can take these Legos, you can't see it, right? I just dropped them here. But I can take them and put them in a pile. I can put as many as I want there. And they will never, ever come together on their own. And it's the same scenario with the nucleotides and the amino acids. You can mix them in any condition you want. They will not assemble on their own. Again, these are the data. So do you see the problem here for evolution? Since none of these molecules can assemble on their own under any conditions, then they could have never come into existence on their own through any natural processes. And folks, once again, I hope you can see this clearly makes evolution impossible scientifically. Evolution would absolutely require it, yet it's scientifically impossible. Poor evolution. You know, even rats know when it's time to get off a sinking ship. Yet the evolutionists just keep trying to make something out of nothing. They are persistent, I'll give them that. Well aware of this enormous problem, they've spent a lot of time and effort trying to show how these molecules of life could have self-assembled. Which brings me to an interesting and eye-opening true story. In the 1960s, Dr. Dean Kenyon and Dr. Gary Steinman proposed the theory of biochemical predestination. In 1969, it became a popular book they authored by the same name, Biochemical Predestination. And by the way, that book still used today. It was their attempt to explain the self-assembly of proteins and nucleic acids from non-living environments, like the prebiotic soup, in the right environmental conditions. Speaking of the prebiotic soup, I like mine with crackers, don't you? Their theory proposed that the properties of amino acids and nucleotides cause them to attract to one another and self-assemble. Yet they came up with this theory and wrote their book without the data to support their theory and book. But they did attempt to generate some data to support their theory through their own research. However, Dr. Kenyon's own research disproved his own theory. What he discovered, and what the rest of science knows from the data, is that you cannot explain DNA, RNA, or proteins through natural chemical processes. Dr. Kenyon's own research, as well as everything else generated by science, shows that nucleotides and amino acids do not have the ability to self-assemble. And what makes this story really interesting is what Dr. Kenyon did after this. The birth of the intelligent design viewpoint is credited to the book The Mystery of Life's Origin, Reassessing Current Theories, which was published in 1984. But in the 1990s, a group of mainstream scientists from numerous disciplines came together to start the intelligent design movement. Guess who was one of those scientists? You guessed it, Dr. Kenyon. So back to the research now. What was discovered and what is widely known is that amino acids do not have an affinity for one another, and nucleotides do not have an affinity for one another. They never had it, and they never will. So please get this. Any and all scientific theories that say that life came about on its own through random natural processes say that nucleotides and amino acids did something that they do not do. Scientific theories try to say that the nucleotides and amino acids self-assembled, which is something the scientific data shows they do not do. Without nucleotides and amino acids doing something they cannot do, life cannot arise via evolution or any scientific theory. Without nucleotides and amino acids being able to self-assemble, life cannot arise via evolution or any other scientific theory. And the scientists know it, even though they'll never volunteer this information or openly discuss it or admit it, nor will it ever be publicized. However, when forced to confront the data and the evidence, every now and then, they'll reluctantly admit the truth in statements such as the one that I showed you in part 1 of this video. And I believe that that statement bears repeating. In a summary of the 4th Congress of the International Society for the Study of the Origin of Life, in 1983, Klaus Doss makes the following statement. For the first time, it has now been determined unequivocally by a large number of scientists that all evolutionary theses that living systems developed from polynucleotides which originated spontaneously are devoid of any empirical base. Again, he's saying that no data exists to support that DNA, RNA, and proteins could have risen via evolutionary processes, and therefore life could not arise via evolutionary processes. In the previous video, I explained how this applies to the fact that all the molecules of life, DNA, RNA, and proteins, must have arisen simultaneously. And now we add to that this statement also refers to how these same molecules will not and cannot self-assemble. Therefore, evolution is simply not possible scientifically. It is impossible. And one more thing I'd like to point out here. Nucleotides have handedness, meaning they're either right-handed or left-handed, all right? For simplicity, even though it's actually not the whole story, you can view them as mirror images of each other. And even though our right and left hands are not mirror images of one another, you can kind of view it that way, okay? They are chemically equivalent, but they're different spatially. Nucleotides almost always form in living organisms, and when they do, they're always right-handed. Only on rare occasions do they form outside of life, but if they do, they'll contain a mixture of right-handed and left-handed nucleotides. And there's no natural mechanism in existence to screen out the left-handed forms. So, if the first nucleotides formed randomly outside of life, there would have been a mixture of both right-handed and left-handed forms. However, since only the right-handed ones are used in life, how could their incorporation into DNA been regulated to include only the right-handed ones when no natural mechanism exists to screen out the left-handed ones? The fact is, there would not have been a discriminatory use of the nucleotides. If DNA formed naturally and randomly, both forms would have been incorporated into DNA from day one. But as we know, this is not the case. Only right-handed nucleotides are incorporated into DNA. But it doesn't stop with the nucleotides. The same story holds true for amino acids. When amino acids are synthesized or found outside of life, they too come in two chemically equivalent forms, right-handed and left-handed. But in life, only left-handed amino acids are used. Now there's an exception that sometimes right-handed amino acids are found in diseased or dying tissue. So their presence is not a good thing. And by the way, if you ever buy amino acids as a supplement, That's what the capital L in front of the name means. It's left-handed. And like nucleotides, no natural process exists that can isolate the right-handed or left-handed versions of amino acids either. So if the first amino acids formed randomly outside of life, there would have been an even mixture of both right-handed and left-handed forms. However, since only the left-handed ones are used in life, how could their incorporation into proteins been regulated to include only the left-handed ones, when no natural mechanism exists to screen out the right-handed forms? The fact is, there would have not been a discriminatory use of amino acids either. If proteins formed naturally and randomly, both forms would have been incorporated into viable proteins from day one. But as we know, this is not the case. Only left-handed amino acids are incorporated into viable proteins. So, we've already shown how evolution is impossible scientifically, and I'm just getting started. There's so much more I have to share with you. So come on back for the next video where we'll move on to the next topic. And if you like what you hear, give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Thank you very much for watching, and as always, we'll leave the light on for you.